My name is Melanie Despeisse. I'm a research associate at the Institute for Manufacturing with the University of Cambridge. And I'm going to present today with Steve Hope, General Manager of Environmental Affairs and Corporate Citizenship at Toyota Motor Europe. And actually we share quite a long history, so I think it's about 6 years of doing sustainability projects together. And today we're going to present to you a TSB feasibility study we did last year actually. So this feasibility study was looking at end-of-life vehicles and how we can look at the value chain network configurations to achieve a circular economy state. So, Steve.
Okay, yeah. So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I don't wish to bore you too much with the detail, but the purpose of showing this slide was really to say that there's been a long history of recycling cars. As long as there's been cars on the road, there's been a requirement for spare parts, and indeed the industry has always been there. There's been dismantlers, there's been shredders, and the like that have been contributing to a very good recycling rate. However, we weren't successful to avoid legislation, and indeed legislation came into consideration in the late 90s, and then all the way through, as you can see here, we started to process down the road of an end-of-life vehicle directive, which came into place in 2003, and then in 2006 we had some targets that we had to meet, and now we're coming up to the next milestone target. The next milestone target, as you'll see there, is in 2015. Also, the EU is leading the world. We're basically, the EU is the only area where there is really strict end-of-life vehicle directive at this moment in time. Many others are watching, many others are thinking about catching up, and in places like Japan, for example, legislation is starting. The targets are increasing, as I mentioned, and one of the things that we're also facing is when we get new legislation, there is sometimes some inconsistency as well. So there is some clash sometimes, and there's been a review recently of the chemicals regulation. So there's banned substances within the end-of-life vehicle directive, but also now we have REACH, which is the chemicals management. We have the other waste directives. There's crossover with waste electrical goods, because you can imagine there's radios and things like that in cars as well. Who takes responsibility for those? And there's batteries as well. And on top of that, one of the other things, of course, is that there is other environmental and safety regulation as well. So we have quite a lot to consider in that area. Actually, you can see here a representation of the actual targets. So the actual directive itself, they're stated for 2006 that we had to get greater than 85%. 80% was recycling, and 5% could be energy recovery, and the rest could still go to landfill. In fact, now for 2015, we've got a target of greater than 95%, and that has to include 85% recycling. There's an allowance for 10% to energy recovery, and only 5% then is allowed to go to landfill. You can see also there that there's great amount of stock placed upon the waste hierarchy as well, and whilst we recognise what was mentioned during some of the other presentations, that we shouldn't regard this as just a staircase that we're climbing up. We should aim at the top. Inevitably, some things are being pushed up through that waste hierarchy as we go. So this is just an indication of some of the operations. We touched on some yesterday. There's the dismantler operations, where actually they will take off certain parts which are required to be taken off by law, such as batteries. They will also take out the catalyst. The reason they do that is purely financial, because there's no requirement to take it out there at that stage, but actually the catalyst has some value because of the precious materials within it. But also, this is where the depollution activity takes place. This is where we drop out all of the fluids from the vehicle, air conditioning fluid, which is recovered, oils, brake fluid, other types of materials such as that. And then, typically, a dismantler will also take off parts that he knows that he can resell. And he may take off some parts to put into stock, things like headlights, fast-moving items, but also he will probably respond in these days to internet requests for parts. So if you want a part for a 1998 Corolla or something like that, you'll be able to put a bid out onto a website, and you'll get dismantlers offering you various parts for that. So that part is actually quite well covered. Finally, what happens then is it goes into the shredder operations, and Graham's in the audience here today. They are very efficient operations these days, and the environmental efficiency is further improved now by the investment, and it is huge investment that is required to put in post-shredder residue equipment so that we can actually separate out materials by various mechanical and chemical sorting methods. So at this moment, we would say we've got a fairly good balance.
Yes. So basically taking over a little bit to provide more details on what's happening at the different stages. So the first step of depollution is required value, as Steve was explaining. And then what happens next is really driven by the market demand, so financially, what is profitable to do. So what I wanted to highlight here is what's happening on the right-hand side of this slide here. So we have certain parts that are being collected and recovered at different stages. And actually, the earlier we can recover those parts and materials, the more pure the material will be. So the more potential there is for reuse or even resales for spare parts. So what we want to do basically is to address as much as possible the treatment before the shredder. So there's quite a lot being done on the sorting technologies for post-shredder residue, but we still really want to increase the quality of the waste coming out of this process. So we really want to focus on the earliest processes. So I have another slide that explains that a little bit better. So this is really based on the targets for 2015, where we have only 5% allowed to landfill. So I believe that for recycling, we should separate between high-value recycling and low-value recycling, because what we can recover after the shredder tends to be less pure, so you cannot recycle the material for the same application. You will have some quality loss in the material. So we call this vertical or open-loop recycling. And what we would like to target, if possible, is a horizontal or closed-loop recycling, where you have the same quality of material and therefore can be reused for the same application. And this is true particularly for critical materials such as copper or rare earth rare metals and materials that are being used in batteries and electric components. So yes, that's what we really wanted to highlight in this study, that most of the value will be in pre-shredder processes. And we believe that at least 20% of the vehicle mass can be dismantled and processed. But now the question is how we can do that in a profitable manner.
This is just a slide, probably a little bit erroneous to show you this slide, but this slide is just showing that actually we have quite good data gathering within the European Union. Each country has to make a country report to say where we are. And actually what we're saying on this slide really is that we've got good result in the UK. We're actually on the 2010 returns here, we were achieving the targets that we were expecting, and indeed this was actually, the system that I'm going to explain to you was actually a cost-effective way of achieving that. So what about the UK specifically? Around 2 million vehicles reach the end of their life every year. So that's quite a large number of vehicles, as you can imagine. And the majority of those are scrapped through what are called authorised treatment facilities, or in the terminology ATFs. And these are all licensed by the Environment Agency. Of course, that means that there are some that are not being treated by authorised treatment facilities, and that is one of the issues that the industry faces, how to get the authorities to police the system in a fair and open way, and to protect the investment of the players that are doing the job correctly. So that's an important part. Actually, there's around 1,500 ATFs in the UK itself. And actually the regulation, or the directive should I say, allows us to consider, or each country to consider, how it wishes to try and achieve compliance. And typically there are around 4 different types of system, but there's 2 here that I'd like to mention. The one that we have within the UK is the own mark system, which basically each vehicle manufacturer is responsible for its own end-of-life vehicle. So anything that comes up with a Toyota or a Lexus brand badge on it belongs to me effectively, or belongs to Toyota, and we have to be able to account for that. And in some other countries, for example in the Netherlands, there's a collective scheme, and the collective scheme works in a different way. A collective scheme, actually everybody pays a levy up front, like you might do in some other industries for their product responsibility directives, and they obviously are taking a certain amount of money in, and then they manage that in a collective manner. Actually, we have to provide a high density of take-back. So as a last owner of the car, 75% of the population has to be within 10 miles of a dismantler or a drop-off point. That's quite difficult to achieve in Scotland, but maybe we won't have to worry about that soon. I'm not sure. Anyway, of course, assuming they stay within the EU. But of course, in some of those less populated areas, there is a relaxation on that. But that does define actually how many people are already within this market that you're having to deal with. So it limits the options to a certain extent. So what do we do as Toyota? Well, actually, there are two compliance schemes which are the main service providers to the manufacturers within the UK. One is called Autogreen and the other one is called Car Takeback, and they basically provide this network solution. So they actually provide us the contact with the dismantlers, so we don't have to have an individual contract with every dismantler. We do it by joining a club in effect. Autogreen is our our partner, and we offer services beyond the strict legal minimum requirement. The legal minimum requirement is we just have to provide free take-back. Now today, I think maybe Graham will agree that most cars can be sold today, because of the way the market is at this moment in time. So one of the other issues we face is that we're setting up this network, and actually potentially we're not getting a big flow of vehicles through that network. Therefore we can't offer our partners within within our network the volume that they really need to justify the investment that they've made. So we're playing a little bit with our hands tied behind our backs. So what we tried to do to try and increase that volume is we did what is called Rewards Recycling Scheme, which is an online facility through our own websites with Toyota. So on the same sites that you will find new cars being advertised, you will also find links on the pages to the recycling side. You can submit the make, model, registration number of the vehicle, and then you will get a quotation back. And the quotation then will allow you to sell your car. You will either have it picked up or you can actually deliver it to a Toyota centre. What we mean by a Toyota centre is a Toyota dealer. This means a change in the mentality of our dealers. Our dealers are normally selling new cars, nice shiny things in nice glass boxes and what have you. They don't like really to have an end-of-life vehicle hanging around their location. But we're persuading them to take part into that because actually it can be a business opportunity for them. Whilst they're probably unlikely to sell them a brand new Lexus because they've just brought in an old Corolla, it's unlikely, but maybe we can sell them a second-hand car. So there is another opportunity for the retailer. And then the evaluation, the electronic valuation, is handed over electronically, and again this is to try and prevent fraud. This is the target achievements right across Europe at this moment in time. You can see United Kingdom's on the right-hand side, and this was the 2012 target rate, and you can see reuse and recovery was 88, and the reuse and recycling itself was 84, so slightly below the targets that we needed to achieve as a country. As our own network, we're able to demonstrate achievement. You'll see there that Germany's managed to step above the 100%. That's very clever, I know, but actually what that is a timing issue because of the scrappage schemes that were implemented. They actually had materials, we believe, in stock which were shown about in a different accounting period, so, shall we say. So 103% seems to be reasonable. So what did we want to try and achieve by this project, basically? So we said at the beginning that we've got an organisation that seems to be in balance, but actually is that optimal? And we believe that at least we should investigate to find out whether it is optimal or not. So this is why we threw this possibility open to the study. And we believe that we can get compliance, but actually as compliance isn't enough. We heard this morning Hugo lay down the challenge to us all to let's think about what is the ultimate position rather than just thinking what is the compliant position. So we can provide compliance, but we want to do better than that. And also we want to try to go, as Melanie said, into the more circular economy. And we want to try and get at least more materials being used as post-consumer materials back into use again. And ideally, you know, what we want to try and do is get car-to-car recycling as well. And we're able to demonstrate on certain components that we're able to achieve that, like battery-to-battery recycling, for example. And we had a strong desire also to work with the academic community on this so that we get some impartiality, because often if we're asked and we give our own results, actually people will question whether it was in our vested interest to say that. So we've done a very much of a hands-off approach to this to a certain extent, and let Melanie actually continue this study to give us some validation. How do we consider our life cycle? Well, we do join up the loop. We don't draw it in a line, and you can see there a typical sort of loop that we're considering through from designing, making, delivering, which is of course a very important part, the delivery of the parts to the factory, but also the delivery of the vehicle to the customer, selling and servicing. Again, logistics involved in that as well, because we have to ship spare parts to the dealers. The actual in-use phase, which, as you realise, accounts for a lot. In terms of CO2, about 85% of the car's impact comes from the in-use phase. And then the bit that we're talking about, which brings us to trying to join the loop together, is the end of the road. Now, Melanie will take us through a little bit more about the cycle and how we've implemented it.
Yes, so basically what we wanted was to take the Toyota 360 approach and try to understand what the end-of-life consideration would be for each one of those steps. So the early measures and material selection are what are coming first. So we've heard quite a bit about product design a bit earlier, and about the critical materials, so the rare earth, rare metals, etc. So in our case, we were really interested in understanding how we can allow a closed loop circulation of parts and materials. And that was particularly the case when thinking about future vehicles and how they can be compatible with vehicles that are on the road today. So this in-between vehicles, so between models, between generations, or maybe even between brands, because Toyota, if they decide to invest in facilities, they may need to recover vehicles that are not only Toyota in order to increase their yield rate. So we were trying to understand how we can build a stronger incentive in recovering the parts, so at dismantling stage. And that would mean maybe thinking about how we design products that are modular, upgradable, and compatible between models and generations. Another consideration that is very important is in the same way we think about the manufacturing of products and how we distribute them and sell them, we may want to think the same way about end-of-life vehicles. So how do we reverse this system? So it's collecting the products, reprocessing them, and redistributing the parts, so the spare parts where they are needed. So whether it is in new vehicles, that is probably a lot more longer-term plan, but how we can also reuse those spare parts in vehicles that are on the road already. So this is more like repair and maintenance schemes. And that links to maybe thinking very closely about how we can make a business model that would generate profit throughout the life of the vehicle, rather than just focusing purely on the sales. So we've heard about leasing schemes or repair and maintenance programs, as River Simple was highlighting a bit earlier. So what we realized when we were looking at all those issues is that we need a very collaborative approach in order to make this system function. So it's very much what Hugo was mentioning earlier about this ecosystem view of the whole value chain, and how each player will kind of selfishly optimize his own system, but if they don't have a shared vision of what they're trying to achieve, they may end up with a suboptimal solution. And we may not be able to reach the EU targets for the whole EU, basically. So now coming back a little bit more on the material composition, I think what the material composition evolution is really highlighting is how components are becoming more complex and more diverse. And you have more embedded value in parts. So there is definitely a big incentive to recover the parts. But because of this increasing complexity and increasing diversity, the job is not going to get easier. On the contrary, it's probably going to be harder, even if we design vehicles today to be more easy to be dismantled and recovered. Most of the vehicles coming in the next 10 years or so are going to be vehicles that have been designed 10, 20 years ago. So we need to think about how we can overcome all those technical issues, and I think the presentation yesterday by Mike was showing dismantling technology is going to play a very, very big role to help us improve the efficiency of reprocessing. So during this study, we actually identified quite a lot of issues. I'm not going to take you through all of them because there are really a big number of them. But one of the difficulties we had was they are not all easy to quantify or to assess in a classic financial business model. So in our case, we just understood these are further discussion points if we wanted to implement any of the configuration that Steve is going to present a bit later. But I think the most important elements that we really need to think very closely about are, first of all, the yield rate. So make sure that we have sufficient volume to make the system viable. And that may mean to have more central treatment of ELVs rather than scattered across the whole country. But then it will involve quite heavy logistics. But if you think about the natural material flow that is occurring currently, so vehicles that are reaching the end of life in the UK may be exported still as vehicles that can go on the road in another country. And this is already happening with a lot of vehicles being exported in Poland. And we know that a lot of factories are based in Eastern Europe. So you have this natural flow of ELVs going from where they were manufactured to the UK and then going back to where they were manufactured. So there may be the possibility to think about how we can recover parts and kind of close the loop closer to the manufacturing facilities that are already existing. So I'm going to hand over to Steve so he can present to you the 3 configurations that we've been looking into, and I present the financial analysis results for the study.
Okay, so as Melanie said, we wanted to start off by looking at this very complex system and just understand how it's actually working. So we decided that we would start off by looking at 3 different scenarios of how we would integrate the business case with the existing ELV chain. And that actually meant that we would consider different levels of Toyota involvement. So from one extreme is that we would use our Toyota dealers as the sole take-back point for Toyota vehicles under our scheme, which is our right to do that if we wish to do that. So that's being quite independent to establishing some regional dismantling centres where we could try to concentrate the number of Toyotas together in one place to maximise our opportunities. Looking at the removal and remanufacturing of high-value components, and indeed even maybe reconditioning some possibility of reconditioning end-of-life vehicles, used vehicles and selling those within our own network as well, using some recovered parts from end-of-life vehicles. And also looking at remanufactured parts which we could actually then retail online as well. So there's 3 configurations. This is the first configuration, and this is really where we take a lot more control than is normal. So the customer would bring the car back to the Toyota retailer or repairer, and then they would collect it, store it, and then ship it as quickly as possible to a regional centre. So we may have 3, 4, 5 of those centres dotted around the country. We would do the depolluting at that area, dismantling. We might consider some parts for separation for remanufacturing, reconditioning, etc. And then we would try to pre-concentrate. And this is really following on from what we mentioned yesterday, destructive dismantling, maybe taking off as many of the plastic parts or similar materials, taking out engines and gearboxes, which is not traditionally done at this type of stage. We could then send those materials to the appropriate recycling partners. We don't intend to start our own shredders, for example. I'm sure Graham will be quite happy about that. And from a configuration 2, it's a slightly different approach. It's using the existing dismantler chain as we are familiar with, collect they would collect, store and depollute, but then they would ship their vehicles. Instead of shipping them to the shredder, they would ship them to a Toyota regional centre where we would do those same sort of activities again. And then the final one is basically, probably you would say, as is today. So that the dismantler would do as much of the dismantling, up to the as much of the dismantling as necessary, maybe delete some part or to extract some parts that Toyota might wish to reprocess. We might collect those together at a reconditioning centre, probably with a supplier, and then retail those as well. So three different extremes, shall we say, or moving between two extremes of our involvement as a company. So with that, we were able to make a couple of conclusions realistically. That using the Toyota centres as take-back points is a feasible option, although it's not necessarily desirable from the dealer's point of view. We could, of course, look at these regional dismantling centres and the high-value components, and we studied the business viability, economic, social, and environmental benefits of each of those scenarios. So, of course, this is feeding into our confidential study, shall we say, and the study then will now provide us a really quite a strong basis for us to consider options for the long-term business plan. So this type of process and this type of project can be very helpful to our organisation, get an independent view and try and feed in some very valuable information into our study. Hopefully that explains a little bit of what we've been doing. So if there's any questions.